For 80 years, the world operated on a single assumption. The seas were free. Not free because nations agreed to be generous, free because one power, the United States, made it structurally irrational for anyone to interfere. The US Navy patrolled the choke points. The dollar settled the trades. The system worked because the cost of breaking it was guaranteed to exceed any possible benefit. That assumption ended in April 2026, not gradually, not theoretically, on a specific day with a specific statement. When President Trump declared that the United States was no longer responsible for protecting straits on behalf of other nations, he didn't just change a policy. He withdrew the structural guarantee that the entire global trading system had been built around. The immediate evidence was physical. Around 1,000 vessels entered holding patterns near the Strait of Hormuz, 800 inside the Gulf waiting to move east, 200 outside waiting to enter. Daily transit volume collapsed from a normal average of 140 ships to between 10 and 15, a 90% reduction. Not because of a war, not because of a blockade, because the guarantee was gone, and without it, the calculus of risk changed for everyone simultaneously. This is what the end of an era looks like. Not an explosion, a stillness. On April 7, 2026, a ceasefire was announced in Islamabad. The language of de-escalation was in place. The world was told the worst had passed. 800 ships stayed exactly where they were, not because the ceasefire was fake, but because the ships, and the financial institutions behind them, had already learned something. Something the announcement couldn't undo, that formal agreements no longer carry structural weight on their own. The old system didn't collapse the moment the US withdrew. It entered a zone where the rules still existed on paper. UNCLOS, international maritime law, ceasefire agreements. But the enforcement architecture behind them had quietly left the room. In that zone, a piece of paper means exactly as much as the power willing to back it. The insurers understood this before the diplomats did. They didn't cancel policies because a war was declared. They cancelled because the entity that had historically made those policies low risk could no longer be priced as a reliable constant. When the guarantor becomes a variable, everything built around its reliability has to be repriced. The ceasefire was real. The ships still didn't move. That gap between what was formally declared and what actually happened is the clearest signal of where the system now stands. The old architecture hasn't fully collapsed, but it no longer functions as designed, and into that gap new logic is already moving in. Here is what most coverage missed. The ships didn't stop because of military force. No navy blockaded the strait. No missiles closed the channel. They stopped because of insurance. On March 5, 2026, 3 of the world's largest maritime war risk insurers cancelled coverage for vessels in Gulf waters. Without war risk insurance, ships cannot legally sail, not because of international law, but because of bank covenants. Every commercial vessel requires active coverage as a loan condition. When coverage disappears, the ship cannot move, regardless of what the captain decides. No navy required. The financial architecture of global trade became the instrument of control. The strait was physically open. The ships couldn't move. Into that vacuum, Iran moved first, charging up to $2 million per VLCC tanker through what it called the Strait of Hormuz Management Plan. Geography converted into a recurring revenue stream. And the payments weren't in dollars. Tehran collected in Chinese yuan, routed through alternative financial rails designed to bypass SWIFT. The toll booth didn't just extract money, it accelerated the construction of a parallel financial system, one transaction at a time. The old system kept seas free by making control too costly. The new system is discovering that control, priced correctly, is extremely profitable. The shift didn't stay at Hormuz. In the first half of 2025, the Strait of Malacca officially surpassed Hormuz as the world's largest oil choke point, 23.2 million barrels per day. When Hormuz seized, Malacca didn't just absorb the pressure, it became the new center of gravity. And the lesson of Hormuz traveled faster than the oil. In April 2026, Indonesia's finance minister proposed a transit levy on vessels passing through Malacca. The legal architecture of UNCLOS Article 26 prohibits passage fees, But the proposal identified the gaps: pilotage services, environmental levies, escort fees. All legal, all functionally a toll. Singapore and Malaysia pushed back. Indonesia walked back the proposal. But the logic didn't walk back with it, because it revealed that the model Iran demonstrated was already being replicated at the next choke point down the chain. Meanwhile, the nations most exposed had already begun to separate. China had built strategic petroleum reserves equivalent to 6 months of consumption, 1.4 billion barrels, a buffer large enough to absorb disruption and negotiate from a position of patience. India entered the same crisis with 9 to 10 days of operational reserves. That gap, 6 months versus 9 days, was not an accident. China had been preparing for the end of the free seas guarantee long before it ended. India had assumed it would hold. When the pricing system arrived, one was ready to negotiate, the other was exposed. What's emerging isn't chaos. Chaos would almost be easier to navigate. Chaos has no logic, no structure, no extractable pattern. What's replacing the free seas order is something more deliberate and more durable. Call it what the analysts are beginning to call it: maritime feudalism. In the feudal model, security was never a public good. It was a private service, provided by whoever controlled the territory, priced according to what the dependent party could not afford to refuse. Lords extracted from those who needed passage. Passage was never free. It was just a question of who set the toll and who had no alternative route. The global trading system is repricing itself along exactly those lines. The choke points that were once maintained as global commons are becoming sovereign assets. The financial instruments that once facilitated trade are becoming instruments of control. The nations that spent decades building alternatives like strategic reserves or overland pipelines are entering this new order with leverage. The nations that assumed the old guarantee would hold are entering it exposed. This transition doesn't require a war to complete. It doesn't require a formal declaration or a treaty or a collapse. It requires only that the pricing logic, once demonstrated to work at one choke point, continues to spread to the next. Hormuz demonstrated the model. Malacca began testing it. The chain doesn't end there. 80 years ago, one power made the seas free by making control too costly. That calculation has inverted. Control is now profitable. The only question left is which choke points haven't been priced yet, and who gets there first.